The courtroom was packed. Lawyers whispered among themselves, journalists hurriedly jotted down details, and the murmur of the audience created a constant buzz in the air. In the midst of that storm, sitting in the defendant's seat, was Emma, a girl of only 10 years, her feet swinging on a bench too high for her stature. She shouldn't have been there. No child should. But against all odds, there she was, facing a system that underestimated her before even hearing her voice. Judge Alistair Munro, a veteran with graying hair and a stern gaze, adjusted his robe with a calculated movement and banged his gavel. "Miss Emma Carter, do you really wish to represent yourself in this trial?" His voice carried a tone of disbelief mixed with disdain. Emma lifted her face. Her eyes, large and attentive, scanned the environment as if deciphering a riddle. She knew exactly what was happening. They expected her to falter. They expected tears, hesitation, a desperate plea for help, but not. "Yes, Your Honor, I am fully aware of what I am doing." The response was firm, without a trace of uncertainty. An uncomfortable silence spread through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, visibly irritated by the girl's audacity. Munro was not known for his patience, nor for his kindness. He liked to crush beginners as one might step on a dry autumn leaf. But Emma was not a dry leaf. She was a wildfire about to consume the magistrate's arrogance. Munro reclined in his worn leather chair, feigning disinterest, but his eyes sparkled with a silent challenge. "Very well. Since you insist, let's test your understanding of the law." He leafed through some papers with a theatrical air before launching his first trap. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what is the fundamental principle of due process?" The question was straightforward, but the way he phrased it made his disdain clear. He expected Emma to stumble, to hesitate even for a second, but she didn't even blink. Due process ensures that no one is deprived of life, liberty, or property without a fair and impartial trial, as established by the 5th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution. Her answer came like a precise shot, clear, concise, without a hint of doubt. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Lawyers who had been distracted with their notes raised their heads, as if they had just witnessed something impossible. Munro, for his part, frowned. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and quickly counterattacked. "And what is the distinction between substantive due process and procedural due process?" Emma tilted her head slightly to the side, as if the question were too simple for the judge's challenging tone. Substantive due process protects an individual's fundamental rights, preventing the government from imposing arbitrary or excessive laws. Procedural due process, on the other hand, ensures that legal procedures are correctly followed, guaranteeing a fair trial before any punishment is applied. The impact of her words was immediate. A murmur swept through the room, like a silent shockwave. Munro, who never allowed defendants or lawyers to destabilize him, blinked slowly, absorbing the answer. For a moment, he appeared vulnerable, a hidden crack in the wall of his authority. Munro did not like to lose, especially not to a 10-year-old girl who still had to climb onto a bench to reach the microphone. His face hardened. He leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the gavel like a predator studying its prey. "Interesting, but let's see if you truly understand what you are saying." His voice carried a note of defiance. "If a law is passed and someone claims it violates substantive due process, what test would the Supreme Court use to assess its constitutionality?" Emma, with the calm of someone who had rehearsed that moment 1,000 times in her mind, did not hesitate. "It depends on the right being affected. If it is a fundamental right, the court will apply the strict scrutiny test, requiring the government to prove a compelling governmental interest, and that the law is the least restrictive means to achieve that interest. If it is not a fundamental right, the test will be rational basis, and the government need only demonstrate that the law has a legitimate purpose and a reasonable relation to that purpose." A heavy silence took over the room. The judge's expression shifted from irritation to something more complex, as if he were re-evaluating everything he believed about the trial. It was impossible to ignore. Emma was not only answering correctly, she was steering the conversation, guiding the courtroom with the precision of someone who understood the law not as an abstract concept, but as a tool for real justice. Veteran lawyers began to exchange glances, some frowning, others offering a discreet smile. That trial, which had seemed like a humiliating formality, was turning into something unexpected. But Monroe was not yet ready to concede. He took a deep breath, crossed his fingers on the table, and launched another attack. "Very well, Miss Carter. Let's move from theory to the real world. Suppose a state law imposes a curfew only for minors without a clear justification. How would you argue against such a law?" His tone sounded casual, but everyone in the room knew it was a well-crafted trap. He wanted Emma to fail in applying theory to practice. Emma adjusted herself in her chair, crossing her small hands on the table, and looked directly into Judge Monroe's eyes. Her gaze was not that of a frightened child, but of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "If the law does not present a clear justification for imposing a curfew solely on minors, I would argue that it violates the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment." She paused briefly, allowing everyone time to absorb her words before continuing. "First, I would demonstrate that this restriction affects the fundamental rights of young people, such as the right to free movement. Then I would use the strict scrutiny test, requiring the state to prove that this law serves a compelling governmental interest, and that there is no less restrictive alternative to achieve that interest." Monroe leaned back slightly. He knew that move. It was the line of reasoning used by experienced lawyers in civil rights cases. But coming from Emma, that was unprecedented. The tension in the room became almost palpable. Members of the audience, previously dispersed, were now completely focused on that unlikely scene. Some journalists exchanged excited glances, scribbling furiously in their notepads. Emma was not only answering questions, she was dictating the rhythm of the trial. However, the judge was still not ready to admit defeat. His pride was a wall built over decades, and he would not let a 10-year-old girl dismantle it so easily. And if the state argued that the law exists to prevent juvenile crimes and maintain public order, he retorted, his voice carrying a false calm, wouldn't that be a legitimate governmental interest? Emma did not miss a beat. She took a deep breath, maintaining her impeccable posture. Public safety can be a legitimate interest, but that does not mean that any restriction is automatically valid. Her voice was serene, yet firm. If the state does not present concrete evidence that this law actually reduces juvenile crime, and if there are less restrictive alternatives, then the measure would be deemed unconstitutional. She offered a slight smile. The Constitution does not allow the government to create laws based solely on assumptions. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. It was as if suddenly everyone was witnessing a performance entirely different from what they had expected. This was no longer merely a preliminary hearing to humiliate a presumptuous child. It was a high-level intellectual showdown, and Monroe knew it. He realized that every word from Emma carried a weight that made his own position tremble. She was not just answering, she was forcing the system to confront itself. The judge took a deep breath, weighing his options. His eyes wandered around the room and landed on the prosecution, which looked equally surprised and perhaps even uncomfortable. The prosecutor, a burly man in a dark suit, was leafing through his papers with abrupt movements, as if desperately searching for something that could turn the tide in his favor. But there wasn't much he could do. Emma was conducting the trial with absurd maturity, dismantling arguments with the precision of a surgeon. "I understand," Monroe finally said, adjusting his glasses. His voice now carried a different weight, as if he were beginning to accept the reality before him. "But let's move to one final scenario, Miss Carter." He paused, crossing his fingers on the table. "Imagine that. In this courtroom, I decide to make a ruling based not on the laws, but on my own interpretation of what is fair. After all, I am the judge and have the authority to do so. How would you contest that decision? Emma blinked slowly, absorbing the question. That was where he wanted to go. The issue was no longer about specific laws, but about the very structure of justice. She straightened her shoulders and spoke with impeccable clarity. If a judge makes a decision based solely on his personal interpretation of what is fair, without respecting precedents or legal principles, he is abusing his authority. That violates the separation of powers and undermines confidence in the judicial system. She paused briefly, letting her words resonate before continuing. A judge may interpret the laws, but he cannot reinvent them according to his will. If that were to happen, I would appeal to a higher instance, demanding that the decision be reviewed and that legality be upheld. Monroe fell silent. The room grew quiet. For the first time, he appeared speechless. The silence that took over the courtroom was not just any silence. It was dense, laden with meaning, the kind of silence that precedes an irreversible moment. Emma had done something few could. She dismantled Monroe's authority without shouting, without directly challenging, without arrogance, only with logic and precision. And the judge knew it. He pressed his lips together, his jaw locked. Throughout his career, Monroe had prided himself on being relentless, on demoralizing those who entered his courtroom unprepared. But here was that 10-year-old girl, not only resisting, but directing the narrative. He looked to the prosecution, expecting some intervention, some counterattack. Nothing, only astonished faces. Then, he cleared his throat and reclined in his chair. "Very well, Miss Carter," he said, his voice now more controlled. "You seem to know the law better than many lawyers who have passed through this courtroom." For the first time, there was something in his tone that bordered on admiration. But Emma did not allow herself to relax. She knew she had not yet won. The prosecution, feeling the ground crumble beneath their feet, decided to intervene. The prosecutor stood up, smoothing his suit as if trying to regain composure. "This is all very impressive," he said, forcing a smile. "But let's be practical. Laws are not just a game of logic, Miss Carter. They are applied by people, and people are fallible. If the system is not perfect, why should we take it so seriously?" Emma leaned slightly forward, her eyes sparkling. "Because if we didn't take it seriously, chaos would prevail," she replied without hesitation. "Human fallibility is not an argument to ignore the laws, but rather to reinforce the need for a fair and well-regulated system. When those in power treat justice as something subjective, what prevents their decisions from being guided by convenience or self-interest?" The response caused the prosecutor to falter for a moment. He had expected to counter an ingenuous argument, not to face a profound reflection. The prosecutor pressed his lips together, trying to hide his discomfort. He knew that if he tried to retort, he risked sinking even further. But leaving Emma's answer uncontested was to admit, before everyone, that a 10-year-old girl had just dismantled his argument in seconds. He looked to Judge Monroe, seeking some form of support, but found only an evaluating, almost intrigued look. Emma, for her part, remained steadfast. What had begun as an unequal trial, where she was to be merely a disposable piece, was now a test of the system itself. She was no longer just defending herself. She was forcing every person in that courtroom to face what justice truly meant. It was Monroe who broke the silence. "Miss Carter," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you argued with precision, demonstrated impressive legal knowledge, and masterfully questioned the system's flaws. But tell me, do you believe that justice always prevails?" Emma lowered her eyes for a moment, thinking. Then she raised her face again, her expression serious, but without losing her determination. "No," she replied simply. "Many times, justice fails, but that does not mean we should stop fighting for it." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It was a raw, real answer. It was not a flowery speech about hope or childish idealism. It was the truth from someone who understood, even at such a young age, that the world did not always function as it should. And yet, some people choose to face that reality with their heads held high. Monroe studied the girl for a long moment. For the first time since he set foot in that courtroom, his posture was not one of superiority, but of genuine respect. He drummed his fingers on the table, as if reflecting on something far greater than that trial. Judge Monroe let out a long sigh, as if he were carrying a weight that no one else could see. For the first time in that trial, he did not have a ready answer. Emma had not only answered his questions accurately, she had turned the tables, forcing him to see the very rigidity of the system he so fervently defended. He adjusted his glasses and looked to the prosecution, expecting them to speak. But the prosecutor remained silent, shoulders tense. It was evident that no one expected that girl to dismantle the entire structure of that trial. The problem was that if they continued pressing, they would only worsen their own situation. Emma noticed the impasse and seized the moment. She leaned slightly forward, with the confidence of someone who knew that the entire courtroom was hanging on her every word. "The issue here is not whether I know the law," she said clearly. "The issue is, why am I here in the first place?" The provocation lingered in the air. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Judge Monroe did not answer immediately. Emma's question was not merely rhetorical. It cruelly and directly exposed the absurdity of that hearing. Emma continued, "From the beginning, this trial wasn't about justice. It was about authority, about proving that a child cannot challenge the system." She looked directly at Monroe. "But the law does not belong to those who shout the loudest or those who wear the robe. The law belongs to everyone. If I am wrong, then prove it with arguments, not with condescension." The entire courtroom fell silent. It was impossible not to admire that girl. She was not there to win a game of logic. She was there to question the very reason for her existence in that room. Monroe folded his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on Emma, as if seeing her for the first time. The entire room seemed to have stopped in time. None of the lawyers dared to whisper. No journalists scribbled in their notepads. Even the bailiffs, usually indifferent, were attentive. The courtroom, which had once seen that girl as a mere curiosity, now regarded her as something more, a challenge, an impossible force to ignore. The judge let out a low, humorless laugh. It was not a laugh of contempt, but of recognition. "You are quite the little incendiary, aren't you?" His voice sounded almost weary, but there was something different in it now. He rested his elbows on the table and leaned slightly forward. "And what do you suggest, Miss Carter? If this trial is not about justice, what should be done?" Emma did not hesitate. "First, admit that it should never have happened." Her answer came without preamble, as cutting as a well-honed blade. "If there are laws that allow situations like this to occur, then the problem isn't me. The problem is the system itself." The impact of her words was immediate. The prosecutor, who had until then been trying to maintain his composure, let out a frustrated sigh. He knew that at that moment, the narrative had completely slipped from his grasp. If they continued insisting, they would only reinforce Emma's argument. She continued, "Laws exist to protect people, not to be used as tools of intimidation. But when a judge or a prosecutor forgets that, when the courtroom becomes a stage for egos instead of a space for justice, who protects the people from the system itself?" Monroe drummed his fingers on the table, deep in thought. He was facing something rare, someone who not only understood the system's flaws, but exposed them without fear, without needing grand speeches or emotional appeals. Only with logic, facts, and truth. Judge Monroe took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he did not have a clear path to follow. If he continued to test Emma, he would only reinforce her argument. If he tried to end the trial without acknowledging the turnaround that had just occurred, he would completely lose authority in front of everyone present. He looked around and saw the attentive faces of the lawyers, journalists, and court officials, all waiting to see how he would react. He knew he had to make a decision, and it wasn't just about that case, but about what he represented. "Miss Carter," he finally said, his voice less rigid than before. "You are right." There was a murmur in the audience. Those words coming from Monroe were something no one had expected to hear. The judge raised one hand, calling for silence, and continued, "This trial should never have taken place. There is no justification for someone, let alone a child, to have to go through this merely to prove a point that should be obvious." The prosecutor paled. He tried to interject, but Monroe raised his hand again. The prosecution had the chance to present a solid case, but all they did was test the legal knowledge of the defendant, as if the value of justice were confined to the ability to recite doctrines. "This isn't a trial, it's a spectacle." He sighed and looked directly at Emma. "And you, Miss Carter, have just reminded us of that." Emma remained silent. For the first time since she had stepped into that courtroom, she realized she no longer needed to fight. The battle had been won. Not because she humiliated Monroe or challenged the prosecution, but because she made the entire courtroom question what was really happening there. Monroe adjusted his robe, picked up his gavel, and looked around before doing what no one would have ever imagined he would do. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, a dry noise that seemed to carry the weight of something much greater than that trial. "This case is dismissed," declared Monroe, his voice firm but without the previous rigidity. "The charges against Emma Carter are dropped. This court acknowledges that it should never have come to this." The impact of his words was immediate. The audience exchanged glances, trying to process what had just happened. Veteran lawyers who had spent decades before Monroe had never seen him back down like this. Journalists were already scribbling furiously, knowing they were witnessing a historic moment. The prosecutor, still in disbelief, abruptly stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "No more," Monroe interrupted, his voice once again assuming an unquestionable tone of authority. He looked directly at the prosecutor, his eyes tired yet resolute. "You had your chance. The court is not here to serve wounded egos." The prosecutor clenched his fists, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. The courtroom was no longer on his side. The narrative had changed, and Emma, at only 10 years old, was responsible for it. She did not smile, did not celebrate. She simply nodded politely, as if she already knew that this was the only acceptable outcome. She calmly gathered her papers, unhurried. The courtroom might have taken a while to understand, but she had always known that that trial was bigger than her. As she stood up, the looks that had once been skeptical and condescending were now full of respect. Some lawyers waved discreetly. Journalists whispered among themselves. Court officials, who before barely spared her a glance, now watched her as if they were in the presence of something unprecedented. And indeed, they were. Before leaving the courtroom, Emma cast one last look at Judge Monroe. She knew that that moment was significant, not only for her, but for everyone present. She faced him calmly, but also with a serenity that only someone so young could carry, a silent wisdom that disarmed any attempt to confront her. The judge, though still maintaining his rigid posture, could not help but acknowledge that, in a way, that look said it all. Monroe was changed. He would not admit it aloud, but there was something in his behavior that betrayed the transformation. He had lost the battle, but perhaps, deep down, he felt that something far greater had been achieved. Not by Emma's victory alone, but by the way she challenged the system with an unexpected clarity and courage. He did not know how it would affect him, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same after that day. Emma walked toward the door with the same lightness of someone who was not merely leaving the courtroom physically, but also closing a chapter of her own story. She did not need applause or recognition. She knew that the true victory lay in what had been revealed. It did not matter the size, the age, or the experience. It was the integrity of questioning what is right and fighting for it with all one's might. Upon leaving the imposing courthouse, Emma stepped into a street where the air seemed fresher, as if the world outside were lighter. She took a deep breath, smelling the city, a mix of concrete and the distant sound of honking horns and hurried conversations. But to her, everything now seemed calmer. The chaos of the trial was behind her, and she felt as though she had just undergone a transformation. As she walked along the busy sidewalks, Emma did not worry about the repercussions of the trial. She knew that the story she had just lived would be remembered in one way or another. But for her, what mattered was what was inside. The confidence she had gained was no longer about the approval of others. It was about understanding that truth, however distant it may seem, always finds a way. And often, that way is forged by the hands of those who refuse to accept the status quo. She passed a group of children playing in the park and, for a moment, stopped to watch them. Perhaps later she would tell them about what happened in that courtroom, but for now she knew that her story was far from over. Emma had only just begun to understand the impact that a voice, even the youngest one, can have on the world around her. And most importantly, she knew that throughout her life she would continue questioning, challenging, and above all, fighting for the truth. As night fell and the sky turned a shade of orange, Emma looked back one last time at the courthouse. She knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The journey of a girl who faced a gigantic system with only the strength of her mind and convictions did not end that day. She felt stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Judge Monroe, the prosecution, everyone there had been merely obstacles. But she had demonstrated truth in its purest form. And truth, she knew, would always prevail. When Emma entered her home that night without saying a word, her mother looked at her with a smile, as if already knowing what had happened. There was no need for explanations. There were no more questions. She already knew. Emma's world was just beginning, and what she had just achieved was not only a victory in a courtroom, but also the understanding that, regardless of age, the courage to be true to oneself is more powerful than any institution or rule. And in that moment, Emma knew that true justice begins with those who choose to fight for it, no matter their size or age.